I've always known there's something. I quickly became aware of this God who knew me and who wanted a relationship with me.
A lot of the love in this world is conditional, but Jesus is different. He loves you because that's just who Jesus is. He's replaced my anxiety with his unconditional love for me.
Home to me is about family. Family is all about comfort and supporting one another.
No matter what I've done or said, he welcomes us into his family with open arms.
Take it away.
Thank you so much. Where's my stool? Here it is. Guys, welcome. It's great to see you here. How's the temperature out there? We're having an ongoing battle with the heater, sometimes too hot, sometimes too cold. The first time I've been out of my gilet on stage, I think. So I'm the perfect temp today. But guys, we are looking at a big one today. We're looking at the question, redeemed, is there meaning in our pain? And I want to start with a story, a true story. A young New Yorker named Glenn Chambers had a lifelong dream to work for God in Ecuador. At the airport on the day of departure, he wanted to send a note to his mother, but he didn't have time to buy a card. He noticed a piece of paper on the terminal floor and picked it up. It turned out to be an advertisement with "why" spread across it. He scribbled his note all around the word "why." That night, his aeroplane, exploded into the 14,000-foot Colombian peak, El Tablazo. When his mother received the note after the news of his death, the question burned up at her from the page. Why? I'm going to lose that. Why? If honest, it's the biggest question in life, isn't it? Especially when it comes to God. Why is there so much darkness, so much evil, so much suffering? And it's a personal one. It's one that faces all of us. Be it looking out at our world and seeing global disasters like tsunamis or earthquakes. Apparently there was an earthquake in Sheffield yesterday. Can you believe it or not? We're not on such safe ground as you may think. Or climate change coming our way. It can be global stuff. It can be wars. It's tragic, isn't it, what's unfolding today in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. And let's keep them in our thoughts. Let's keep them in our prayers, that crisis over there. Actually, my wife and I, down in London, we have an occasional cleaner when my efforts aren't enough, and I don't produce many efforts. But our cleaner is from Ukraine. And a friend of mine who shares her, also uses her, texted on WhatsApp this morning saying she turned up at his house today, and he asked her about it because she's from Ukraine, and she just burst into tears because her son has had to travel back from the UK to the Ukraine to sign up to fight. It's a personal thing for each one of us, whether it's on a global scale, whether it's on a community scale. Any Crown fans out there? Netflix, The Crown. Do you remember the episode with the Aberfan Wales disaster, the coal tip that collapsed and went down the side of a hill and completely swamped and buried a junior school, killing 116 kids and 28 adults? Heartbreaking, suffering on a community scale. But relevant to each one of us on an individual level, each one of us will face suffering of one kind or another. And you could be in the tent today and you could be going through hell. You could be at your lowest ebb. And I think on behalf of the CU and every Christian in here, I want to say we're here for you guys. If that's you, please reach out to us. Please come and talk to us. We want to come alongside you. We want to help you. We want to support you any way we can. But whether it's sickness or a broken relationship or anxiety or depression, this issue of suffering touches each one of us. And it's also specifically a Judeo-Christian issue because we are the faith tradition that believes that God is not only all-powerful, but he is also all-good. And this isn't a question that just Durham CU have come up with this week. This is a question, the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, is a question that philosophers, theologians have been wrestling with for centuries. And the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus framed it like this. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? So how do we explain it? I just want to spend a few minutes looking, I guess, at the Christian view, the Christian explanation for evil, for suffering in our world, to give us just a touch point for some ideas that perhaps we can then discuss over Q&A. And there are 4 insights that the Bible holds out. The first is that humans have freedom. The good news today is that the Bible holds out a story where there is no suffering at the start. Right at the beginning of the book of the Bible, there is no suffering. And there is also going to be no suffering at the end. That's a vision of where history is headed one day. But we know that things have gone wrong, and the Bible tells us that things went wrong when human beings turned their backs on God. We read about it with Adam and Eve, who took the fruit, they listened to the serpent, and they ate that fruit. And sin entered the world through their free choice. And with it came suffering, decay, and death. And let's be honest, so much of the world's suffering that we see around us is caused by human choice, isn't it? Think of maybe you're experiencing this yourself, or you know it in loved ones, family members, people who drink too much, or people who abuse drugs, or begin gambling, people who speed and get into trouble driving. There are consequences to our actions, but it's also other stuff that all of us will wrestle with, be it greed or lust or gluttony. Think of the bigger issues facing our world, starvation. That's simply from human beings not sharing. There's enough food for everyone. Or extreme poverty. We could solve that tomorrow if the governments of the world were willing to, if human beings exercised their free choice. Even what's going on in Ukraine right now is because of the free choice of human agents. Our choices bring pain. And someone's estimated that about 95% of the suffering in the world at any given time is because of human choice. So you might ask, well, if that's the case, why does God allow it? Why does he allow us to make these bad choices? But just imagine if he didn't. God allows it because he gives us free will. He loves us. He respects us. He allows us to live grown-up lives and for there to be consequences to our actions. If he just rubbed out the bad mistakes we made, I mean, life might go slightly easier for some of us, but it wouldn't be a free life, would it? It wouldn't be a life worth living. So suffering, the source of suffering is largely connected to our freedom. That's what the Bible tells us. The rest of suffering, the other 5% added to the 95%, well, that just comes from living in a fallen world. That's what the Bible tells us. The world is broken, but there's a happy ending. We'll see more of that in a moment. So that's the first thing. There is human freedom, and that's the cause of suffering. The second thing to know about suffering is that God uses suffering. Now, I can obviously only speak to you as a follower of Jesus, as a Christian, but on behalf of every other Christian, I think, in the room, as cheesy as it sounds, I can honestly say that in moments of suffering, when things are tough, those are times that actually draw us closer to God. The theologian and academic C.S. Lewis wrote this: God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And perhaps you've seen that in the lives of those you know, friends, loved ones, that they go through a tough time and somehow it takes them to God. It opens them up to consider the bigger questions of life. These are moments when we realize that we're not invincible, because we like to go through life thinking we're invincible, don't we? I remember some years ago, I was on a church ski trip, and it was fancy dress day, and I dressed up in the Superman outfit, and I thought I was pretty special, with a pair of sunnies on, and I was just bombing down, just casually minding my own business down a slope, going quite fast, and it looked pretty empty until suddenly I saw there's a group of women there, they're skiing, and then suddenly when I got parallel with them, this woman she threw a 90-degree turn out of nowhere, and I was suddenly confronted with, I am going to clatter this lady. And so I just threw myself to the left. My skis went one side of her boots, my body went the other. And I did momentarily fly like Superman through the air, but I landed on my hip in the most painful way, crushing my It was the most sort of ignominious end to my outfit. Ironic. Superman just going for a spill. And I came away with the biggest bruise I've ever had. I mean, a proper hematoma on my hip. It was bulging out about that size, black. Because, guys, even though we may like to pretend that we're invincible, that nothing can beat us, that we're going to live forever, we are fragile. And we bruise. We bleed. We die. So let that be an eye-opener. If you're hearing that for the first time, don't want to, burst your bubble today. If you're hearing that for the first time, we need a savior. We need a hope beyond the grave. So God uses suffering to wake us up, to bring us to him. Also, we can learn maturity, can't we, through the tough times that we face, whether you're a Christian or whether you're not a Christian. The Bible tells us that even Jesus learned obedience from what he suffered. And also speaks of God disciplining those he loves, like a father disciplines his son or his daughter. Discipline doesn't feel good, does it? Any gym bunnies in the house today? Bryn, you'll know about this. I mean, it's painful at the time, isn't it? All of this discipline, going on a run. Did anyone go running today? Who's been exercising today? Was it nice? What? One person? Two? Did you feel up for doing it before you went? Yes, that's not helping me. Anyone else? When I think about going for a run, I think I could do that, or I could just continue to sit here. Anyone else with me on that? Because it feels painful. I don't want the pain. I love the fruits, the results, but I don't want the pain. But God can use suffering and challenges to refine us, to refine our character, to give us more patience, more compassion, more humility. It's like a pearl. Do you know how a pearl in the ocean is formed? It's when a little bit of grit or a foreign object enters the shell of the pearl and begins to irritate it, begins to annoy it, dig into it. And the pearl doesn't like that, wishes it was gone, but it can't get it out of its shell. So it begins to wrap it in the nacre, N-A-C-R-E, which is what the shell is made of. Googled that this morning. And the wrapping of it in this sort of fluid then becomes hard and produces a pearl, this thing that is beautiful. And it's a bit like us with suffering. God can use suffering to do that with us if we will only let him. A friend of mine's dad, a long-time lawyer and now judge, Christopher Compton, wrote this. Over 23 years ago, my first son, Harry, died after only 36 hours. At the time, his death seemed monstrously unfair, and in one sense, it undoubtedly was. Now, with hindsight, I'm quite certain his death was one of the best things that has ever happened to me, in that it began the process of breaking me down, so that with God's grace, I could begin to understand how other people felt and how other people suffered. David Watson, a famous vicar from some years ago in the UK, who also battled cancer, from which he eventually died, he wrote this shortly before his death about the power of suffering to make God's work in people's lives all the more evident. He wrote, "There is no doubt that millions of Christians all down the centuries have become more Christ-like through suffering. I know of many who have an almost ethereal beauty about them, refined through pain. In fact, those who have experienced more of the love of God than anyone I've ever met have also endured more suffering. When you crush lavender, you find its full fragrance. When you squeeze an orange, you extract its sweet juice. In the same way, it is often through pains and hurts that we develop the fragrance and sweetness of Jesus in our lives." An agnostic professor of philosophy at Princeton University became a Christian when he studied carefully the lives of some of the great saints of God throughout the history of the church. What struck him especially was their radiance in the midst of pain. Often they suffered intensely, far more than most other people. Yet through all their agony, their spirits shone with a glorious luster that defied extinction. This philosopher became convinced that some power was at work within them. And this discovery eventually brought that professor to Christ. God can also bring about his good purposes through suffering. You know the story of Joseph, multicolored jacket that he was given, coat by his father, made his brothers jealous. His brothers threw him in a pit. They sold him into slavery. They thought he was gone, forgotten about. But he later became prime minister and was able to deliver his brothers and his family and many others from famine, from dying. And then when he met his brothers some years later, they came before him. They didn't recognize him. He revealed himself. They were terrified, but he said, "Don't worry. You intended it for harm, but God intended it for good. The saving of many lives. God can bring about his good purposes through whatever you face, whatever you're going through right now. If you'll trust in him, he is at work. But let's be honest, sometimes it's not easy to see it, especially when we're in the midst of it. Handley Moule, it's a relevant one for you guys, when he was Bishop of Durham, had the task of visiting the relatives of 170 miners who had been killed in a mining accident. While he was wondering what to say to them, he picked up a little bookmark his mother had given him. As he held it up, on the reverse side of the hand-woven bookmark, there was a tangled web. It was a tapestry. There was no rhyme, no reason, no pattern, nothing. But on the other side of the bookmark, it said, God is love. Folks, the world may seem like a tangled web, but behind it all is the love of God. The third thing we can see, or the Bible says about suffering and hope within it, is that God more than compensates us for our suffering. Again, Joseph, thrown into slavery, begins in the pit, goes to jail when Potiphar's wife misaccuses him. But eventually he's freed and he becomes prime minister of the whole of Egypt. The story of Job, who suffered more than anyone in all of the Bible. He lost everything, his family, his wealth, his home, his community, his dignity. He lost it all, but because he held fast to God, put his trust in God, God blessed him at the end with more than he had at the beginning. God more than compensates, folks, whatever we might face in this life. That's why Paul in the New Testament, writing all the letters, a lot of the letters of the New Testament, he was able to write this: I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. Later, on another occasion, he wrote this: for our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. That's the hope that Christians get to hold on to, that there is a life to come where everything will be in the rear-view mirror, and it will all have been worth it. Gavin Reed, who was the bishop of Maidstone, tells of a boy in his congregation who shattered his back falling down the stairs at the age of 1, and who had consequently been in and out of hospital his whole life. When Gavin interviewed him in church, the boy remarked, God is fair. Gavin stopped him and said, how old are you? The boy replied, 17. How many years have you been in and out of hospital? The boy answered, 13 years. He was asked, do you think that that is fair? He replied, God's got all of eternity to make it up to me. I love that. God's got all of eternity to make it up to me. And God's got all of eternity to make it up to you, folks. Whatever you're facing, whatever you're going through. It's why we put on these events, why we gather in this strange tent with weird temperatures going on, to make known this good news to you that life can make sense. That because of Jesus Christ, it does make sense. If you'll open the door to him and welcome him into your life. Because for Christians, the promise of heaven is something to really look forward to. It's coming. And sometimes on our worst days, it's only that gets us through. It's only the hope of that helps us in the toughest times. Good times are coming. And one day, folks, in eternity, we are going to get immortal resurrection bodies with which to do life. And that's going to be a joy. Bryn somehow got hold of his body a little earlier than the rest of us. But we are all going to get it. If you trust in Jesus, sorry. I just love just digging him out. It's great. Good times are coming. God can more than compensate for our suffering, for our pain. And finally, and most importantly, God is involved in our suffering. It's tempting, isn't it? Like, I remember when I wasn't a Christian up until the age of 18, if I'd ever discuss God or get into a conversation, I'd sort of look at the world and say, well, it can't be that loving. Look at the world. I'd sort of point the finger at God and accuse him having let us down. But friends, because of Jesus, we can know one thing. Suffering can mean many things, but one thing it cannot mean is that God doesn't love us. Because he became one of us. And he came and suffered too, in the person of Jesus. He experienced our weakness, our pain. He even experienced our death, so that he could redeem us and redeem it all. He is the God who suffered for us, but equally amazingly, he is the God who suffers with us. There's an amazing section in a short play called The Long Silence that powerfully makes this point, with which I'll end. And it says this: at the end of time, billions of people were scattered on a great plain before God's throne. Most shrank back from the brilliant light before them. But some groups near the front talked heatedly, not with cringing shame, but with belligerence. Can God judge us? How can he know about suffering? Snapped a young brunette. She ripped open a sleeve to reveal a tattooed number from a Nazi concentration camp. We endured terror, beatings, torture, death. In another group, a young man lowered his collar. What about this, he demanded, showing an ugly rope burn. Lynched for no crime other than being black. In another crowd, a pregnant schoolgirl with sullen eyes. Why should I suffer, she murmured. It wasn't my fault. Far out across the plain, there were hundreds of such groups. Each had a complaint against God for the evil and suffering he permitted in his world. How lucky God was to live in heaven where all was sweetness and light, where there was no weeping or fear or hunger or hatred. What did God know of all that man had been forced to endure in this world? For God leads a pretty sheltered life, they said. So each of these groups sent forth their leader, chosen because he had suffered the most, a Jew, a young black man, a person from Hiroshima, a horribly deformed arthritic, a thalidomide child. In the center of the plain, they consulted with each other. At last, they were ready to present their case. It was rather clever. Before God could be qualified to be their judge, he must endure what they had endured. Their decision was that God should be sentenced to live on earth as a man. Let him be born a Jew. Let the legitimacy of his birth be doubted. Give him a work so difficult that even his family will think him out of his mind when he tries to do it. Let him be betrayed by his closest friends. Let him face false charges, be tried by a prejudiced jury, and convicted by a cowardly judge. Let him be tortured. At the last, let him see what it means to be terribly alone. Then let him die. Let him die so that there can be no doubt that he died. Let there be a great host of witnesses to verify it. As each leader announced his portion of the sentence, loud murmurs of approval went up from the throng of people assembled. And when the last had finished pronouncing sentence, there was a long silence. No one uttered another word. No one moved. For suddenly, all knew that God had already served his sentence. Thanks for listening, folks.